Okay.
Yes, hello, Clarence.
Hello, Ariel. Okay, we are switching the screen. Okay, can you actually see us? You can see us, right?
I can see you and hear you, yeah.
Okay, hi. Okay, so shall we extend a round of applause to Ariel Nasr? Thank you so much for joining us, Ariel. This documentary is very, very powerful and actually, well, in a way, tragically, also very timely, given what's happened in Afghanistan for the past few months, if not for the past year. So maybe I'm sure the audience would have a lot of questions to ask you. So I promise I wouldn't hog the microphone for too long. But I think the question that I'd like to ask here would probably be the one the audience here would have in mind. So what's the current situation with Afghan film? I mean, with the archives. Have you heard anything about what's going on there?
Well, yes, I have, Clarence. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for programming the film for the Hong Kong Asian Film Festival. It's an honor to be able to present to your audience. So thank you so much. So to answer your question, the last few months have been incredibly hard for anyone who has a connection to Afghanistan. As you can imagine, life has been completely turned upside down for people there, people who invested in the 20 years, 2 decades. It's a long time, right? So people built businesses, they had careers, they built lives for themselves, they built identities as artists, and all that is now unfortunately gone. And so, of course, you know, myself, I have family, many friends and many colleagues in Afghanistan. And so I've been following the situation very closely and constantly in touch with people there and inundated with requests for help and doing everything that I can. Although, you know, it's been very frustrating because it's very, very difficult to get people out right now. So in terms of the filmmakers themselves, some have managed to leave. So Yasemin Yarmal, who you see in the film, thankfully, she was able to go to Paris actually about 6 weeks ago. So she's out of the country. Engineer Latif is still in Kabul. Siddiq Barmak is in France, and Yusuf Janissar, he's okay. His current job is still to be the official camera person for the party that came out of Masood's party, right? The Northern Alliance Party. And so he is still a political figure, and so he's protected. But for many of the archivists, it's been a very, very difficult time, and people are in hiding. They are worried for their lives, and they're trying to find a way out of Afghanistan. And we have been with a network of friends and diasporan Afghans across, across the world. We've been trying to help people where we can to get them outside. The films themselves are a different question. So after I finished making this film, when we were kind of at the end of our editing process or offline edit, I had gone back to Afghanistan, and there basically what happened is the president's office decided unilaterally to move the entire archive from this public space called Afghan Films that you see in the film into a special facility that had been built that was located right inside the presidential palace compound, right? And they said, well, this will be safer. We have more security here. It's true. The presidential palace compound in Kabul is one of the most secure places in the country, maybe outside of only the US embassy. So, you know, my first thought was, it's a mixed blessing. Yes, physically it's safer from bombings, but depending on who comes into power, you know, that can be also a dangerous space for these films. And you know, we had no idea what would happen. But of course, now, a couple of years later, you know, the Taliban are in power and they are occupying the space where the films are. Now, I don't think that there's any reason to believe that they will burn the films. As you saw in The Forbidden Reel, you see this man, Isaq Nizami, right? The ex-Taliban official. And what he says is, it wasn't an official decree. It wasn't an official government decree coming straight down from the president's office to burn these films back when they were burned in the last regime. It was actually a band of fanatics, a band that was even a group that was even more more extreme than most of the Taliban, who were tolerated, right? This kind of behavior was tolerated. So there was a lot of kind of vigilantism, right? So this was a group of iconoclastic vigilantes who were going around and destroying these cultural artifacts for religious reasons, and they were tolerated by the Taliban. So I don't think that the films are in imminent danger, but it's extremely worrying because we really don't know. So, of course, many people are worried about this and looking into hopefully diplomatic ways that we can help to reinforce the importance of this cultural heritage to the new government. But it's a very worrying situation.
Some of the films, they have already been transported out of the country during the past few years, haven't they? I mean, I understand that the National Film Board of Canada, I mean, would have at their disposal some films because, well, Sarah Karimi, the head of Afghan film, she told me, like, for example, The House of History, Like an Eagle, well, these films which we have just seen in your documentary, there are copies in Canada, aren't there?
Yes, fortunately, Clarence, we have these very high quality digital copies that we were able to make in Canada. So during the making of The Forbidden Reel, the president of Afghan Film at the time, the previous president to Sarah, Ibrahim Arifi, he brought personally 19 films from Afghanistan to Montreal, Canada, and there we were able to digitize them all on our state-of-the-art equipment at the National Film Board. And so thankfully we have high quality, archival quality copies that can be restored to the highest quality. And of course we share those back with the archive itself. But yes, we have kept a copy of all of those.
But your project for The Forbidden Reel began even before these films appeared in Canada, didn't it? I mean, you already had this project, this idea in your head, well, several years ago. How did that come into being?
Well, you know, I'm the son of an Afghan man, but I was born here in Canada, right? And growing up, you know, my father, he gave me such a sense of my Afghan identity that I always thought of myself as an Afghan person, even though I had never been to Afghanistan. So when I got older, I started to go to Afghanistan, and that's really what stimulated my filmmaking as well, Clarence. It was like, this place is changing so fast, and we need to capture these stories, you know. And there's so many stereotypes about Afghanistan, but very few like really deep stories. And so I really wanted to do that work, and so I started making these films. And through this filmmaking, I ended up meeting some of the Afghan filmmakers. And the first person I met was Engineer Latif. Now, Engineer Latif, he was the president of Afghan Film, and at the time, any film production in Afghanistan had to be permitted, had to have a permit from the Office of Afghan Film. So I went in there first just to get a permit for a project I was working on. And to be honest with you, most of the foreign filmmakers, they didn't bother to go to the office. They would just make the film and go and whatever. But I felt as an Afghan citizen that I had to follow, you know, I should follow all the rules that any Afghan person would follow. So I went, and it turned out to be a total blessing because I got to meet this guy, Engineer Latif. And when I first met him, he was like the picture of a communist. You know, I walked into his amazing, I mean, an Afghan communist specifically. I walked into his office, and there he was sitting at like a, you know, a 60-year-old's desk, wearing this like this kind of khaki colored outfit with the watch cap. And above his head, there was a big 3-dimensional wooden model of the most amazing film campus, film studios that you could ever imagine, right? And at the bottom, it said Afghan Films. So I said, like, what is this? Like, what is this fantasy, you know? And he said, that was the communist vision, the Soviet vision for Afghan film. So in the 80s, they planned to build this huge film hub that would be the hub for all of Central Asia filmmaking, right? And it never came to be, but he still had it up behind his desk. Those communist years for Latif were this kind of golden age of filmmaking, right? Because he was so enabled to make his films during that time. Still people in Kabul used to call him like that old communist, right? But that's what. So he was the first I met, and I wanted to, and I got to know him, and I know his nephew now, who he actually lives in Vancouver. He's a filmmaker as well, and so he's become almost like a uncle to me, but I knew I couldn't just tell the story with Latif, because it would have too much focus on communism, and it wouldn't tell the story of all those who resisted communism in the 1980s. And so I thought to myself, there must be another filmmaker who resisted, who fought against communism, somebody on the other side of this story. And that was Siddiq Barmak, who actually I already knew because he was one of the most famous filmmakers there, but I just didn't know his story. And so I came to find out that these two filmmakers were close friends. One taught the other, mentored the other. And then, of course, they were torn apart during the Soviet-Afghan war, as happened to so many friends. And but even though they were on opposite sides of this conflict, this ideological conflict, they still communicated with each other. And what's so amazing to me about film in the milieu of Afghanistan is that cinema there became a kind of ideology in and of itself, right? It speaks to modernity. It speaks to kind of unity, because there wasn't a lot of literacy. So films could reach out to the whole country. And they were a tool to talk about progressive politics. So they were a way to tell people in the countryside that women can have rights. Women can do the same things that men can do, for example, right? That was one of the big messages. And so these men and women were so committed to filmmaking that it transcended all the other ideologies that came and went in Afghanistan.
So actually, yeah, your documentary showed us such a complex portrayal of Afghanistan, also Afghan cinema, because probably people who are not who didn't know that part of history, they might have a one-sided idea of what Afghanistan was like. I mean, it would be people in burqas and just that, but there is a section of communist history, the communist era, which actually the filmmakers, they did arts and cinema very differently.
That's true. That's true. And in fact, invented their own national cinema. And that's one of the things that fascinated me the most, is this idea that you have a country where there's very little development. There's very little trace of modernity, right? You have some cars, right? But most people don't use them. They're really for the elite. You have some telephones in the city. This is like the extent. You have an airport, a couple of airports. Like that's the extent of a couple of hydroelectric dams. That's the extent of modernity for most people. They're still using horses and to pull the plow. And into that mix, you bring cinema. So in the 60s, this new facility was built. And Afghan Film, the interesting thing about that building is it's actually this complete film studio in and of itself. It had processing, it had dark rooms, it had everything you would need for film and photography and everything you would need to really have a film production. And so they were able to start, but they really had very little outside interference, outside training. And so they really created their own cinema. And as he says in the beginning, we didn't want to be like Iranian cinema, or especially not Indian cinema. There were all these very strong cinema cultures around them, but they really created their own. And to me, that was a fascinating reason to make the film.
Okay. So Ariel, maybe, well, actually, I have a lot more questions to ask you, but as I said, I think the audience would have a lot of questions to ask you too. So maybe we should just open it up to the floor to see whether anyone would want to ask Ariel a question about the documentary, about Afghan cinema, and about cinema in general. If you do have any questions, please raise your hand, and then my colleague will pass you the microphone with this gentleman here.
Hello. I would like to ask why the documentary stopped in 2001. Like, is there few things to talk about after like the Taliban, like 2001? So is there like, I would like to ask why you stop at this, at that point? Yeah.
Yes, it's a good question. I really wanted to make a film that reflected the archive. So I wanted to speak through the archive. So in every chapter of the film, it's really these archival films that are telling the story. And so when you get to 2001, actually not even 2001, when you get to 1996, the archive really stops. There's nothing there. And so so at that point, I was looking for my ending. To me, I think in some ways, there was a totally new chapter that started in 2001, and maybe it's another film, but there was a completely new chapter that started, and it started fresh, right? Because film was done. So that whole heritage and legacy of filmmaking, all of those people who came up in the time that you see in this film, they no longer really had skills that were applicable to the current environment. And so I think it's another film, honestly. And also, to me, because I was trying to tell the story of the archive, the archival material kind of ends. And then for me, the last chapter of that was, finding them again, and then watching them again, and then understanding their importance and trying to digitize them, right? And really, so the contemporary element that you see is really those images and those moments in the archive with Ibrahim Arifi, like bringing the digitization machines, or the cleaning machines. But to be honest, the story of this archive really kind of ended, other than the attempt to digitize films, it really kind of ended in 1996. And then they rescued the films from the Taliban, and then they found them again. But that was, so I guess it's about the scope of, and my focus being on the archival films, and then following that, I guess, as a way to tell the story. And that's how I found my ending. But it's a very good question, and I think, if I had another 2 hours, I would tell the story of the last 20 years.
Yes, maybe
in cinema.
Maybe we should book a late night space, so the late night berth, so that we can talk more about what we have. But maybe we'll see whether there are any other questions from the audience, please. Okay, anyone would want to add? Yes, the friend over there.
Hi, thank you for filming this documentary. I think that for those who just follow what had happened recently in Afghanistan, will be very surprised that Afghanistan has once had such a vibrant movie culture in the past, because it seems that all of them have been wiped out in past few decades. So I'm really wonder what will be the reason for especially those newborn Afghanistan, what will be the reaction when they knew that their country once had such a vibrant movie culture, which I doubt if it still exists now in the country?
Yes, what a great question, and thank you for that. To tell you the truth, one of the reasons why I make films about Afghanistan is to provide something to people like me, to be honest with you, because growing up in Canada even, and I have cousins who have lived in Cuba, and they've grown up in Germany, and they've grown up obviously in Afghanistan or Iran or Pakistan. So we don't necessarily have a lot of access to this culture, right? It's been so disrupted and by so much conflict that it's really hard to access it. And so to me, in a way, this is like, I had access to this archive, right? And not very many people did, because I had access to it because I was in Kabul. I knew the filmmakers, I had relationships. And so I could go in and say to the archivist, like, what do you have, about this? Or what do you have from this time? What do you have from 1972? And they would go and find it for me. There's no catalog. These things were not online. They're not available. And so part of my, I think, deep drive to make this project was to offer to Afghan people in Afghanistan, but also all around the world, some image of their own, some reflection of their own culture, and not to say this is the way it is or this is the way it was, but to say, look at all this material and look, we can tell our own stories. We can tell our own histories using our own materials, you know, and so to try to inspire. And my most enthusiastic audiences have been Afghan and regional audiences, and it's really gratifying because I know that it will live inside them, and it will hopefully inspire people to search more for their own culture and to use it as inspiration, as I did.
Actually, Ariel, did you have the opportunity to show the Forbidden Reel to Afghan audiences after finishing it?
I did in October 2019. We had rushed to finish the film for IDFA, actually, for the International Documentary Festival Amsterdam. But before we went there, of course, we had to show it to the people who helped us make it, right? We had to show it to the people who were in it. So we went to Afghanistan for a short trip, a 1-week trip, and we showed it in the screening room. It's kind of similar to where you guys are now, except very old. It looks somewhat similar. It's a little smaller, and we offered it to Afghan Film, all their employees, and everybody that they wanted to bring in. We had a packed hall, and it was like a party. People had such a great time watching this film because it was their own story, you know. And afterwards, people were giving speeches, and it went on for a very long time. It was very touching. We had a second screening at the Serena Hotel, which is the kind of 5-star hotel in the most secure hotel in Kabul. And because we wanted to bring like some VIPs from the government, because our idea was, let's get people excited about this film and then let's distribute it across the country, across Afghanistan, right? And Sahra Karimi, who you mentioned before, she was like really enthusiastic about that. Unfortunately, the day we showed it, there was a bomb threat on the hotel and a massive flood, a flash flood through the city because there was a big rainfall. But we still had, I don't know, about 40 people, I think, came. And we got a lot of excitement about distributing this film. And so we made some plans and a contract with the National Film Board and Afghan Films, but it never happened because of COVID, actually. And before we managed to do it, as like I'm sure all of your lives were disrupted, it was completely, that plan was disrupted. So we still hope to do it one day, but right now, the situation being what it is, it's a little difficult to see how it's possible.
So Ariel, maybe we'll see whether there are any further questions from the audience. Okay, please. The lady over there.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the documentary. It's very impressive. I just have a question. So I didn't see a lot of like talks or like reflections on the politics, especially when it comes to the second part, jihad and the what's a word? It's like the mujahideen. The civil war, yes, the civil war. I just didn't see a lot of like reflections from the directors, those very famous directors. They didn't really talk about the war and how the war impacts the like develop of the movie industry, something like that. Is it because the whole thing is still a taboo, or that would bring some like further impacts to their life and safety, something like that? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. That's a part of the film. Sorry, that's a part of the film that I really thought was very important to get them to talk. And I felt I got them to at least talk a little bit, which I felt, but I'll tell you a little bit more detail about why this was challenging. So the Civil War, they call this period the Dawre Muqamat, the resistance period. And because you have all these people who fought to resist communism and to push I think it was less about ideology, to be honest, and more about culture, to push this kind of what they saw as a foreign culture outside of Afghanistan. And one of the biggest, most famous leaders of this resistance was Ahmad Shah Massoud, right? And Ahmad Shah Massoud, who became extremely famous, he was based in this little valley called the Panjshir Valley, right? And you hear a little bit of talk about this in the film. So there are two of the main people in the film who are from that area and who are really followers of Masood. And one is Siddiq Barmak, and the other one is Yusuf Janasar. And then the third actually is engineer Latif, because Latif really became a follower of Masood eventually. And so after the fall of communism. And when the people who follow Masood, this is like, you can't say it's a religion, but they follow him not only as a political leader, but also as a spiritual leader. And so their loyalty to him is so deep that nobody will say, nobody who follows him is likely to say anything against him, right? And so that was a challenging moment because of course the war involved Masood, and Masood at the time was the Minister of Defense inside Kabul, and he was located inside actually the very building where I interviewed Latif. You see that kind of almost palace, the ruined palace where I interviewed Latif. That is it's an old palace on the outskirts of Kabul, and so that's where Masood was stationed as the Minister of Defense. And on the outside, you had other forces like Hekmatyar and others, Dostum, who were sieging Kabul, who were bombing Kabul, right? And then all kinds of street fighting. So basically to the people of Kabul, who are, you know, the people in Afghanistan who have the biggest voice and they're the most intellectual class, to those people, everyone involved in that war is basically a criminal, right? Because they took the only place that had been spared from the Soviet-Afghan conflict and they reduced it to rubble. And when I first went to Afghanistan in 2005, I mean, you could walk for 20 minutes in ruins on both sides, you know? The city was really destroyed. And so I wanted to get from them like this sense of, okay, you have these heroes who then fall and they become villains in some sense. But it's very hard to get that kind of self-reflection when you have this type of political loyalty. And so the furthest I was able to get was, you know, Yusuf Janasar saying, you know, I thought I would go back to school, and instead, you know, the war continued and it was a deep sadness. You know, and then I thought the other thing that spoke really eloquently about that was this film, House of History, which is a documentation of that destruction and really makes it visible. And so to me, that's the most cinematic way to speak against that period of conflict. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
And we have another guest.
No. But I think Mariam actually mentioned in the documentary that, well, it's about time that that particular era in Afghan history, the Mujahideen history, could be spoken publicly and interpreted publicly, and hopefully this will happen. But yeah, I think it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's going to take some time, I think, before, you know, people on the fringes of the conflict who weren't involved and don't have loyalties can speak about it, I think, with more clarity. But this was an insider story, right? This is a story about people who were really there. And so, yeah, I hope that I guess my hope is that the images speak louder than any words could.
Okay, Ariel. Sadly, we are running out of time because we've got another screening coming up. Although, well, we do still have a lot of questions to ask you, but hopefully, well, we have another opportunity to do that, and hopefully, well, the Forbidden Reel will be shown at more festivals in the future. So, thank you very much, Ariel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Clarence.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Take
so
care.
much.
Bye.
Okay. Bye bye.